Well, firstly, let me thank my hosts for the very kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. My topic today is immigration and freedom, and as you've just heard, this is a topic that is very much a question for our times. This is the subject also of a book that I'm writing called Immigration and Freedom. Often when one writes a book, one thinks one must finish it quickly before the issue disappears, but I don't think this is going to happen. The title of the book is Immigration and Freedom, very deliberately, because what I want to do in this book and in this lecture is talk about the question of freedom. And this is a word you don't often hear in discussions of immigration, except to the extent that people sometimes say we need to slow or stop or prevent or control immigration in order to protect our values. And in Europe, people often say the value is freedom. What I want to say in this lecture, this is the main message of the lecture, is that immigration control poses a threat to freedom. And it poses a threat not to the freedom of immigrants or would-be immigrants, but it poses a threat to citizens and residents in their own countries. This is the basic message of the book and of my lecture. And what I hope to do in the next 45 minutes is persuade you of this, not to persuade you that everything is going to go into disaster the moment we start slowing our obsession with controlling immigration, but I do want to say that there are unintended consequences that we need to be aware of. And I'll start with a quotation from the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who said, "We asked for workers and got people instead." And the point of this here is to say that when we're thinking about immigration, it's very, very tempted simply to think in economic terms, to think about the movement of labor, to think about the movement of factors of production. And what I want to say is, actually, we're talking about human beings. Now, this is not just because human beings have rights that ought to be recognized, or this is important too, but it's important also to realize that human beings, as human beings, don't come to us into the world and don't live in the world in isolation. They come with a lot of baggage. They have family, they have friends, they have relations of all kinds, they have associations, they have workers themselves, they have employers. They come with a full collection of relationships. And those who want to control immigration often forget this, as if they think you could simply move people from one place to another, to quote Adam Smith, like pieces on a chessboard. And I want to say we need to get away from thinking in these terms. And thinking about immigration in terms of freedom is perhaps a crucial part of this. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand a few different things. Firstly, we need to understand what immigration might mean, and this also means understanding what borders are. It means understanding why it is that immigration control does pose a danger to freedom, and also why it poses a danger to equality, which is a very important value for liberals, because all citizens should be regarded as equal before the law, and it poses a danger to the rule of law itself. So the first half of my lecture is going to be concerned with explaining what immigration means, why it's a worry for freedom, why it's a worry from the perspective of equality and the rule of law. In the second half, I'll consider some objections to this view, coming from those who might want to say, well, even if it is a danger to freedom, well, maybe it's worth it nonetheless. Maybe there are economic reasons we should be keen to control immigration, or perhaps there are cultural reasons, or perhaps there are reasons of self-determination. And what I want to suggest is that these reasons don't really stand up. They don't really give us reason to think more carefully and critically about immigration control and the danger it poses to freedom. So let me start with the question of definition, because this is something that's often avoided or neglected. Firstly, many countries, including the United Kingdom, don't actually have a definition of immigrant or immigration, even though they have policies concerning this. The British government, for example, had a policy, now abandoned, of reducing net migration to the UK to 100,000 people a year or fewer. Net migration refers to the difference between the number of people entering the country as immigrants and the number of people leaving the country or emigrating. But all of this without having a definition of immigrant. The only category the UK has is a category of people with a right of abode. So strictly speaking, someone from the EU, at least until Brexit, who moves to Britain is not an immigrant. All the people moving from Romania to London are not immigrants because they have a right of abode. So how are we going to define immigrants? Well, the UN defines an immigrant as someone who's moved to a country not of their own nationality to live elsewhere for a year or more. So if you're there for 364 days, you're not an immigrant. And if you live there for 365, you are. So here's one way we could slash immigration overnight. We'll say you're not an immigrant unless you stay for 2 years. This would really cut down immigration so massively without any cost. Okay? Or we could increase immigration by saying anyone who comes in as a tourist is an immigrant. If that's the case, in the United States in 2013, there were 362 million immigrants who moved into the country, because that's how many people crossed the border that year. Okay? So this tells you something. Immigration is something that does not rely on definitions that identify natural kinds. There's no such thing as an immigrant as a natural thing. An immigrant is a category that's the product of a legal definition. And that definition is arbitrary, and it can change, and it does change all the time. Now, the same thing is true for borders. What is a border? Well, for much of the discussion of immigration, people talk about the border as if it's simply a line that's crossed. Okay? But immigration is not about crossing a border. If that's the case, as I said, there would have been 362 million immigrants into the United States, excluding illegal and unknown immigrants, in 2013. So crossing the border is not the crucial thing. The question is, what kinds of rights do you have once you cross the border? Do you have the right to stay? Do you have the right to reside? Do you have the right to get a job? Do you have the right to become a student or to teach or to set up a business? These are the things that immigration control largely determines. Of course, it affects whether you can cross the border, but since most countries, especially in the developed West, want to have people to come in, as tourists in particular, they want the hotels to be full, even if they want the neighborhoods to be very quiet, most countries want people to come in. So if we're going to think about what immigration control is, we've got to recognize that it's not about stopping border crossings, it's about controlling what people do. And that means that if you want to think about the borders and the openness of the borders, you've got to think a little bit more carefully about what this actually means. It doesn't just mean entry. On the other hand, it doesn't mean citizenship or membership either, because many people who migrate don't become citizens. I'm a resident in the United Kingdom and have been for 9 years. I'm not a citizen. I became eligible to become a citizen last year, but I have not taken up this right yet, though I probably will. But many people don't. In Australia, the government encourages people who become residents to become citizens, and most people do, except for the British. The British who move to Australia don't like to become Australian citizens, probably because of their cricket and football allegiances. But, so we're not talking about membership, and we're not talking about entry. We're talking about a combination of these things. In fact, we're talking also about the extent to which people have the right to participate in a society. So the openness of a society to immigration is really a matter of these three things in combination. And you can see that, you could think about a country along a number of different dimensions, therefore. You can think about a country and ask, does it allow for entry into the society? Does it allow participation, for example, in the labor market? And does it allow membership? A country could have very open borders because it says yes on all three. It could have very closed borders because it says no on all three. But it could also have a combination. It might say, yes, you can enter, yes, you can participate, but you can't become a citizen. Or it could say, yes, you can enter, but no, you can't work, and no, you can't become a citizen. Here are the 8 logical combinations, the 8 logical possibilities. So the openness of a society to immigration is a matter of some combination of these things. And you can make a society, therefore, more open to immigration without admitting one more citizen. You could also make it more open by making it easier on each of these categories. Easier to enter, easier to participate, easier to become a member. Think of it in these cases, okay? Imagine 3 countries, A, B, and C. Okay? Not a very imaginative list of names, but never mind, okay? So you can imagine a country that has very, very easy entry. You can become, you can come as a tourist without any difficulty. Britain is a bit like that. You don't need a visa to come to Britain from most countries. From some countries you do, but most countries you don't need one. Whereas in the United States, very few countries aren't subject to a visa requirement of some kind. Well, maybe it's easier to come in, but it's very hard to get permission to work, okay? And maybe very, very difficult to actually become a citizen. But you could imagine a country where it's very difficult to get in and even more difficult to get work. But once you've actually been allowed in and allowed to work, well, maybe they'll make it very easy for you to become a citizen. Or you could imagine a place that's very, very difficult to enter in the first place. Once you enter, it's difficult to get the right, or it's easy to get the right to work, but still very hard to get membership. Well, that means that if you're going to make the borders more open, you could do so just by making it easier in any of these categories without admitting a single more person. And my point here is simply to say immigration control is not just about how many people enter the country. It's about what they can do and how easy it is for them to do what they want to do most of the time, which is to live, to work, to study, to trade, to do business, maybe to fall in love, maybe to marry, to do all kinds of things. You can make all of these things easier and thereby make the country much more a country of open borders without admitting a single more person. Okay? Now, this then brings me to my main theme. Why would we care about this? Well, one reason we might care about this, of course, is that we care about the rest of the world. We care about the fact that there may be people who want to exercise their freedom to move, to travel, to visit, and perhaps to take up work, or to marry someone they've fallen in love with, or set up a business where they see an opportunity. And national boundaries seem like artificial and unnecessary barriers. But I'm going to put that question aside and say there's another reason we should be concerned about this, not from the perspective of our concern for people out there, for the foreign, but from the perspective of our own interests and of our own freedom in particular. Why is this so? Well, mainly because immigration control, as I've already suggested, is about controlling people. It's about controlling what they do. It's about controlling them by limiting the rights that they have. But you can't control some people without controlling almost everyone. That's the problem. You can't control outsiders without controlling insiders. If you want to control immigrants and would-be immigrants by restricting their ability to work, to study, to set up business, to trade, to marry, do all of these things, your problem is your fellow citizens and residents aren't going to cooperate for the most part. They will marry them, whether you like it or not. They will give them work. They will trade with them. They will do business. They will admit them to university. They will do all kinds of things because, in the end, relationships between people are human relationships. They're not relationships among factors of production. They're not relations among political agents. They're relations among people. So if you want to control the outsiders, you're going to have to control the insiders. You're going to have to regulate them. You're going to have to monitor them. You're going to have to punish them when they break the rules. 3 years ago, the British government shut down a part of London Metropolitan University. The reason for this was that London Metropolitan University had not been adequately monitoring its overseas and therefore all its students to make sure that they were compliant with all the visa requirements. The result of this was that many students had their courses abandoned, many of them had to move to other universities, and many of them simply had to abandon their studies altogether. Many lecturers now found that they did not have jobs because of this stance taken by the government. Now, the government was doing this because it was trying to control not its own citizens in the first instance, but people they regarded as potential immigrants. But they could not do that directly. They could only do that by imposing on the university a requirement that they register, monitor, regulate, control their students, and then report back to the Home Office. And the Home Office, in turn, monitored them. And when they failed in their compliance duties, everything went bad. This is just one example that's familiar to people in universities. But you can imagine this is a story that's familiar to any employer. It's familiar to any person trying to engage in trade. It's familiar to anyone who's trying to get someone they want to marry a visa in order to either come to the country or stay in the country. They will have to be subject to these controls. To give you another very simple example, very, very common, I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of these. One of my colleagues is Albanian. Her husband is British. Her 2 children were born in London. She invited her mother from Albania to come to London to spend a few weeks with their new baby. But the visa was denied on the grounds that in the application, when Leah explained why her mother would be coming, she said, well, to play, visit, look after the children. And the Home Office said, well, that means you're looking for employment, which is not permitted. So her mother cannot come to visit her grandchildren, her English grandchildren, because this would put her in violation of labour law. These are laws, of course, designed to keep out keep out employees, potentially, and supposedly protect the British labour market. Leah did not, incidentally, go off and hire a nanny immediately. She didn't want her nanny, she wanted her mother. Okay? So the freedom of ordinary people are impacted in these ways continuously. I mean, and I said, this is not an isolated case. And it's also true in the United States, for example. If you're going there to visit a daughter or a son and play with your grandchildren, don't say anything about helping around the house. In fact, when you go there, I think this is a very good reason to say to your son or daughter, sorry, I can't help with the dishes because, I could be deported. Okay? Here's an analogy, actually, that's surprisingly close to home. This is the apartheid analogy. South Africa set up a system of controls to prevent black people from associating with white people and to keep them separate from white society. This policy had its origins in the late 19th century, but it began really in the post-war years with all seriousness. The purpose of the policy was to keep black people in separate development. But the problem was they also needed the labor supply. In order to maintain that labor supply, they had to have people reasonably close by, but even then it was inconvenient. So in the end, they had to allow black members of the society to come and live in white areas. But in order to enforce the separation, they needed 2 things, really. Firstly, they needed then to monitor them, which meant monitoring their own citizens. Eventually, although initially only blacks were subject to the pass laws, having to show their papers whenever they moved, eventually whites were subject to very, very similar sorts of controls. But the other thing they had to do was they had to develop an ideology of apartheid, to say this is the way things ought to be. That control eventually led to a system of controls on whites that was much more extensive through the limitation of access to the courts and through the development of a much stronger police presence, much stronger control on publications and on newspapers, and eventually controls on everybody. This is a necessary part of social control. If you're going to control some people, you'll end up controlling everyone. Here's what Mr. Cameron had to say, almost as if to make my point for me when he was talking about the Calais crisis recently. He said, we're going to have to make it harder for these people to come to Britain, to make it less attractive. And he said, since I became Prime Minister, we've made it harder to get a driving license, to get a bank account, to get a council house, and we've removed more people through deportation. We're controlling the internal borders. Well, that's my point. The borders are not outside or on the margin, they're inside. And in trying to make it harder for immigrants to get a license, or to get a bank account, or get a house, you're making it harder for everybody. I can say this as someone who's the warden of a university residence. Every year the students set up a social committee which has a president and a treasurer and a secretary. And the treasurer has to manage the students' finances. But the problem is foreign students aren't eligible to have the kind of bank account that allows them to do this. So we're always struggling because in an international institution like the LSE, we often can't run a social committee because of attempts to control foreigners. Employment regulation, education, they're all areas in which we find more and more extensive controls on people in order to achieve the ends of immigration control. These are controls, as I said, not just on outsiders, but they're controls on citizens themselves. The ideology of apartheid is perhaps an extreme version of this, but the reason for pointing to this particular example is that not so much that we can see there's something racist about this, that's not my point at all. The point is that you will start off trying to control black, but you'll end up controlling white. In fact, you can't make that distinction. It's not a meaningful distinction from the point of view of control. You either control or you don't control. And if you want to subject yourselves to control, immigration control is one way of going about this. I'm sorry, I think... okay. So, my fundamental point is about the impact of immigration control on freedom. But let me turn from this then to say a little bit about why it means not just a loss of freedom, but a loss of other important values, values which are, in a sense, important for the sustaining of any kind of free society. These are the values of equality and the rule of law. Why do these things become endangered? Well, the first thing to understand here is that immigration control in a free society, a liberal democratic society, is going to be something that can only be conducted through the processes of law. Okay? Because you cannot simply pick someone up arbitrarily and deal with him or her without giving them the full benefit of the law. But the problem that you'll encounter whenever you try to engage a policy with a particular goal as an outcome is that the law then becomes not so much something that enables this as something that is also an obstacle to this. If you set yourself a target of deporting so many people, for example, or reducing the numbers of people who are entering the country, or a target of a net migration rate of so many hundred thousands a year, you will have to manage this through all the legal and institutional processes that govern the lives of everybody in that society. And that means that you may not be able to achieve that end. Mr. Trump has suggested that since there are 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States, we need a more extensive policy of deportation, and that when he becomes president, this is what he will do immediately. He will deport those 12 million people. Well, right now the US has the capacity legally, through its institutions of deportation, to deport 400,000 people a year. So do the maths. If you've got 12 million and you can do 400,000 a year, in 10 years you're not even going to be halfway. Okay? Mr. Trump would have 8 years if he was elected twice. So he's going to have to ratchet up the number of not just enforcement officials, but also the number of people who are dealing with these issues through the bureaucracy and through the courts. You could increase the number of civil servants without too much difficulty. It'll be a costly thing, but it's not all that easy suddenly to create courts that can deal with an extra, in a single year, an extra 11.5 million cases. It's simply not going to be the case. That's assuming that no deportable or illegal immigrants come into the country in that period. So what do you do? Well, what governments typically do is they then try to find a way around the law. And there is a long history of this. And in a certain sense, just as the movement of people is the result of supply and demand, any attempt to control markets by restricting the movement of goods is going to create other routes whereby these things happen. The same is true of governments. If they've got a policy and they can't achieve it through legal means, they will find other ways. And this is what, for example, in the United States has been happening for a very long time, at different levels, at different stages. Did you know that between 1940 and 2000, the United States deported 1 million American citizens? By mistake, of course. You can't deport a citizen legally. Okay? But in an attempt to get around the law, in order to deport people they thought of as undesirable, they deported 1 million of their own people. They did this because they engaged in sweeps that went through neighborhoods, picked up people who looked like they were Mexicans, and sent them off. If they didn't have papers, well, that proved that they were illegal. But of course, if you're a citizen, why would you have any papers? You're born in a place, if you haven't got a passport because you've not traveled, you wouldn't need any papers. But if you look Mexican, well, the assumption is you should have papers. 1 million citizens. So this is my point. Immigration control is control, and it's control over your own citizens. It's affecting the freedom of ordinary people, not just of outsiders. And it's prompting an interference with the legal process, which becomes an obstacle to the operations of the state. Now, many people want to say, look, yes, what we should do is fix the system, but not allow for these sorts of things to happen. But the point I want to make here is that this, to use a fairly nerdy sort of terminology, this is not a bug, this is a feature. Okay? This is not something that, an upgrade is going to sort out. Okay? This is something that's permanently locked into the structure of this enterprise, which is to control people. If you control people, you're going to have to survey, you're going to have to monitor, you're going to have to regulate. And since you still won't achieve your ends, you will see injustice. You will see these things happening. You can see it as a matter of economic logic. You can also see it in the history. You look at the history of any immigrant nation, the more seriously it's tried to control immigration, the more seriously it's infringed the rights of its own citizens. Well, someone might listen to all of this and say, well, okay, that seems plausible enough, but maybe it's just worth it anyway. Maybe we need to control immigration, even if it does cost us some of our freedom, because of the gains. Okay? And there are three kinds of arguments you could have here. One is a kind of economic argument that says, well, the economic benefits will be great enough to offset the loss of freedom. Another would be to say that there are cultural benefits, and these will offset the loss of freedom. And finally, there's the argument that says, well, self-determination is what's most important. And in order to be self-determining, we have to control immigration and our borders. Let me look at each of these arguments in turn. With the economic arguments, I think there are two aspects we should consider. One is the impact of immigration on wealth and income. And the second thing is the impact of immigration on the distribution of wealth and income. These aren't the only economic issues, but I'm just going to say something briefly about each of these. There is quite a bit of debate among economists about the impact of immigration. Very, very vigorous debate. The curious thing about this debate is that it's really a debate about whether immigration has a 0.9% positive influence or a 0.9% negative influence. That's the margin. We're not talking about arguments about people who are saying, no, immigration is going to economically crush us, and people who are saying, no, immigration is going to lead to a vast boom. It's about that margin. In a way, it's a bit like having an argument about the impact of women entering the workforce, which started to happen in a serious way since the 1920s. If an economist spent his time now debating this question, he'll be regarded as a bit crazy. And I'm saying he, because I doubt that a woman economist would want to spend any time on this, but it would not be regarded as a serious question. Yet economists are spending a lot of energy on this very question. Well, perhaps it's useful because there is a public debate about this at least, and that's disappeared when it comes to women in the workforce. But the take-home point here is that even if you think immigration has a negative consequence, the negative consequence is very small, almost immeasurably small. I'm trying to think of the term, but the range of error is significant enough that whatever your conclusions, they're really compromised by the fact that there's no really significant story that you can tell, at least not in economic terms. So maybe the bigger question is the question of the impact of immigration on the distribution of wealth. And here there are many issues and arguments to consider, but I'll just focus on one, which is the claim that what immigration does is it harms the poor. Those who are wealthy, people such as ourselves, gain from immigration because we get cheaper labor and then the cheaper goods that come with having cheaper labor. But the poor guy who's working on the factory floor, the agricultural laborer, well, he's the one who's going to have to compete with these people, and his wages are going to go down. That's the general argument. Now, once again, the evidence of this is not encouraging from the point of view of those who want to limit immigration. Of course, when anybody gets a job, somebody else misses out on it. So we can't deny that an immigrant coming in will take away some job that could have gone to someone who was local. But firstly, we have to ask, well, what is the impact of an immigrant coming in, or of many immigrants coming in, on the nature of the labor market? Okay. So one common observation is that, well, it all depends on what kinds of immigrants come in. Are they immigrants who substitute labor, or are they immigrants who skill complement labor? If it's the latter, they create more jobs. If it's the former, then they displace people. But it's not easy to distinguish these two categories of people because many people do a bit of both. Okay? So once again, it's very hard to show clearly that people are being displaced. But even to the extent that we can say that some people are displaced, we can't say whether this overall is to the disadvantage of all people who might end up being displaced. Because there are many people who would be displaced in employment if we restricted immigration. Because if we restricted, that will itself change the nature of the market and the demand for labor, and will affect local workers. If you, for example, limited trade. And you said we're going to set up tariff barriers to stop so many imports. Well, the people you'll affect are all of those workers who work in companies that import cars, that repair imported cars, and so on. So the displacement argument, or the distribution argument, is really one that at best shows that there's a very, very tiny number of people who are badly affected. We can't identify them very easily. Most of them, in the United States, for example, tend to be those who are at the college dropout level of skill, and they tend to be the previous generation of immigrants. They're the ones who are most affected. So the economic arguments on the whole don't seem to give a very strong reason for limiting our own freedom. We're not gaining anything. We're losing our freedom, but economically we're not benefiting. Indeed, no one is benefiting. Even if you take the case of, for example, an agricultural worker in Britain who might say, look, there are all these Polish immigrants coming in, and as a result, wages in the agricultural sector have dropped. Well, sure, he's suffered a loss in wages, but you can't assume that if you had not imported any of this immigrant labor, that what would have happened is that his wages would have risen. They might have, or that business might have said, well, look, we can't compete on the market with tomatoes which are picked at £10 an hour because we can't sell them, so we'll shut up shop. We'll close that business. That worker now may not just suffer a loss of wages or of income, he may suffer the loss of a job. Not necessarily, in some cases, yes, in some cases, no, but you can't assume that just because you're facing competition and suffering a loss in wages, that is something that will be improved if you limited immigration. So the economic arguments, I think, are not compelling. What about the cultural argument? Here the argument is that we need to control immigration because we need to preserve our own society's traditions and values. We need to keep it kind of integrated society so that everybody feels attached to it and committed to it, and we share the same values. Now, it may depend a little bit on what kind of a country you're talking about. Now, maybe if you're talking about a country like Tibet, for example, where there's considerable homogeneity, leaving aside the invasion of Chinese as a result of the takeover of Tibet in the late 1950s, they might have an argument here. But if we are talking about a modern liberal democracy which is internally diverse, not only because of immigration, but because there are different sorts of peoples who've lived there for a long time, that's more problematic. Firstly, claims about cultural homogeneity are always much exaggerated. That's because they tend to be stronger when there is a kind of external enemy or problem, but once that goes, internal divisions always appear. People are different. They belong to different groups, they belong to different religions, they belong to different traditions, and there's a certain amount of tension in society at any one time. To try to make the cultural character of a country a subject of political decision is a very dangerous thing to do. Because if you do that, then you run the risk immediately of any minority group being disaffected because the definition that's going to be given is not one that they will be happy with. If you were to say that India is a Hindu nation, all of the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Christians are going to be very troubled by this. Because it is a Hindu nation, but it's also a Muslim one, it's also a Buddhist one, it's also a Christian one. There are millions of all of these people within there. If you try to say that the national language must be Hindi, even if 70% of the people speak it, it's going to be a problem for those 150 million Tamils, for the Gujaratis, for the Punjabis, who don't see this as the national language. In fact, many of them would prefer that the national language be English, not because they speak it better, but because it's in some senses, not always, but in some senses neutral. If you want to push this issue of cultural unity, you will have to be prepared for internal conflict and strife. But there's another problem that then arises too from the point of view of equality. Let's say that what you want to do is you want to control your borders, control immigration, in order to preserve a kind of cultural integrity, to preserve the existing cultural structure of your country. Well, there are two ways of controlling immigration as far as the entry of immigrants is concerned. One is you could do it by simply reducing the numbers, and the other thing you could do is by selecting people. Now, if what you want to do is preserve cultural integrity, you want to make sure that things don't change, what you have to do is you have to select people from the right cultural backgrounds. You don't want people coming in from the wrong culture. Now, leave aside the whole issue of race and racism here. Many Western liberal democracies are worried about this, and they want to pursue a liberal, egalitarian policy that has no truck with racism. But if you're going to be selective, this is going to be much more difficult to sustain in accordance with your own traditions. But leave that aside for the moment. What you have to do is say to some of your citizens, look, I'm sorry, you can't invite your family back. You can't hire the sort of people that you want because we're trying to preserve cultural integrity. You're going to have to treat different groups and communities in your own country differently. You will have to treat them unequally. Now, if you are a liberal democracy and you want to preserve equality before the law, this is the dilemma you'll confront. Well, you could say, look, no, we're not going to be selective. We're just going to reduce the numbers of people. Well, this may not solve your problem either, because then if you're not selective, if people come in from different parts of the world and the balance changes, you may not preserve the kind of cultural integrity that you think you're going to preserve. You'll have to be selective. And this, of course, is going to open up a whole range of troubles within your own society. The more diverse it is already, the more difficult it's going to be to control immigration. But what about the final argument that says, well, okay, of course there is a loss of freedom, but we must nonetheless control our borders in the name of self-determination. What we have to do is control our own borders. Mrs. May said as much today in defending the decision for Britain to leave the European Union. We will control our own immigration. Well, that's fine. But now, what exactly does the self-determination amount to here? Because you could, of course, exercise your self-determination and say, we choose to have more immigrants and less immigration control. That's still, of course, controlling your own immigration policy. You're doing so by having many fewer controls, having borders that are more rather than less open, having less bureaucracy, having fewer regulations, having less monitoring of citizens. You could choose that in the name of self-determination. But for some reason, people seem to think, at least those in government, that self-determination means closing the border. But it doesn't. Self-determination, at best, just means taking your own decisions politically. But the trouble is that if you go down that path to say, in the name of self-determination, we're going to restrict movement, we're going to control citizens, we're going to control and monitor and survey everybody, it's hard to see why this is actually self-determination. What kind of self-determination is it if you put a fence around yourself and lock yourself in and survey all your citizens? If this is self-determination, I think I'd rather be out of it. If self-determination is imprisoning yourself, this does not seem like the ideal form for a free society to take. And to say that there's self-determination really means, well, there's collective self-determination. But here what I want to say is, well, is collective self-determination really consonant with individual determination? Individual self-determination. Those who advocate self-determination should think again, what does the self refer to? Is there a collective self of the kind that they're thinking? And does that really reflect what everybody individually thinks? I suggest not, because if you understand how democratic processes operate, decisions about collective control are taken by national governments sensitive to the electoral process, worried about marginal seats, and inclined to pander to particular well-placed interests. And it is they who will take the decision. And the decision will, in the end, not be one that favors everybody. It will favor some over others. It will favor some preferences over others. There are many people who want to have immigrants and more of them, just as there are many who want to have fewer of them. But what these are preferences, to a large extent, over the preferences of other people. Is this what self-determination amounts to? And if it is this really consonant with individual freedom? Is it consonant with any meaningful sense of self-determination at all? The Australian politician Pauline Hanson, who came to notoriety about 20 years ago on a very, very strong anti-immigrant platform, set up the One Nation Party and galvanized a kind of anti-immigrant and anti-minorities mentality, famously said, "Australia is my home, and I should be able to decide who comes into my home." It was a very powerful metaphor, but I want to unpack that a little bit. Think about this question. Should you have the right to control who comes into your own home? Well, it depends on who's living there. If you're in a single flat on your own, I'd say, yep, you should have full control over who comes in. Maybe unless there's a fire and a fireman needs to get into the building, but otherwise, that's for you. Now, if you're living as a married couple, should you have the right of veto over anybody coming in? You could. I think it will make for an unhappy marriage, but you could have that rule. If you have children, you could say to the children, no, Daddy says who can and can't come in, and if I say no, that's it. No freedom. Be prepared for very, very grumbling children. Okay? But now, supposing you're not just talking about your own flat with your own family, but you're talking about a condo, okay? It's a building with, let's say, 30 flats. Do you want to have a rule that says each individual has the right of veto over anybody inviting somebody else in? You could have that rule too. I think make it a very unpleasant place to live. It will be a condominium that now has to have border guards. It will have to have checks on your home. You'll have to have intrusions to make sure you aren't harboring a visitor, without everybody else's permission. You'll need a bureaucracy. Now, imagine we're not talking about a condo, but a neighborhood, or a city, or a province, or a state. Okay? Well, my point is, the more you want to say, the crucial thing is I have the right to decide who comes into my home, the more you'll have to answer the question, well, what kind of right are you talking about? Do you really think that you should have a veto, or that some subgroup should have a veto? Is this a nice kind of a society to build? Okay. There's a famous article by a Canadian political theorist named Joseph Cairns. He's a great defender of open borders. And in this paper, he begins with a very dramatic opening line. There's borders have guards, and guards have guns. He's trying to make the point that immigration control is about the exercise of violence. I think that's a very important point, except that it needs to be qualified, or at least deconstructed a little bit. My point is that the guards aren't at the border. They're at the border, of course. They're also overseas at other checkpoints, whether it's in Calais or whether it's in the offices of the countries where people might visit. And they're also internal. They're not only patrolmen well inside the border between the US and Mexico, but there are patrolmen in the cities and in the towns checking on people. Immigration control does mean guards, it does mean guns, but a lot of the time, I've been trying to say, those guns aren't pointed outwards, they're pointed in. And that's why we need to be concerned about the impact of immigration on our freedom. Thank you.